Dear viewers, imagine living in a community so remote that for 9 months of the year, the only way to reach the outside world is by plane. Every food item you eat, every medicine you need, every construction material required for your home arrives by air freight at 3 to 4 times the price paid by those living in southern Canada. In winter weather permitting, a temporary ice road opens for a few precious weeks. Trucks race against time to deliver a year's worth of supplies before the ice melts and the road disappears. During the months when the ice road is closed, if someone in your family has a medical emergency, you hope the emergency medical response aircraft can land in time. This is not a scenario from the 19th century, nor is it the description of a failed state in a war-torn region. This is the reality for communities stretching along the Mackenzie Valley in Canada's Northwest Territories in 2026. Tulita, population 500. Fort Good Hope, population 520. Norman Wells, population 760. Canadian citizens living without the basic infrastructure that citizens in all other provinces take for granted. A road connection that could provide year-round access to the rest of Canada. Their isolation is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is the result of broken promises stretching back 68 years. In 1958, the Government of Canada announced the Roads to Resources program, a vision to connect Canada's Arctic communities with all-season highways that would unlock economic development, reduce cost of living, and assert Canadian sovereignty in the north. The Mackenzie Valley Highway was part of that vision, a 321-kilometer two-lane gravel road connecting Wrigley in the south to Norman Wells in the north, providing the first permanent transportation link through the central Mackenzie Valley. The vision was clear, the need was obvious, the promise was made, and then nothing happened. Decades passed, governments changed, plans were drafted and shelved, environmental assessments were started and stalled, funding was promised and never delivered. The people of the Mackenzie Valley watched their southern neighbors build highways, bridges, and transit systems with federal money while their communities remained isolated. They watched resource companies extract billions of dollars worth of oil and gas and diamonds from their lands while they could not afford to buy groceries. In 2013, hope surged when the territorial government filed applications for land and water licenses to build the highway at an estimated cost of $1.67 billion. Finally, after 55 years of waiting, construction would begin. But 18 months later, the government cut the highway route by more than half to reduce costs to $700 million. The full connection to the Dempster Highway was abandoned. Even the shortened route never got built. More studies, more assessments, more delays, more broken promises. By 2025, community leaders had heard enough excuses. Danny McNeely of the Sahtu Secretariat spoke with resignation and determination. They've been talking about the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the all-season road, for over 50 years. If it doesn't happen, we ain't gonna stop. We'll talk for another 50 years about that. That statement captures 68 years of frustration, hope, disappointment, and refusal to give up. But in late 2025, something changed. Prime Minister Mark Carney returned from his China visit and his meetings in Europe with a new focus on Arctic sovereignty and nation-building infrastructure. He established the Major Projects Office to fast-track projects of national importance, and he looked north. Premier R.J. Simpson of the Northwest Territories traveled to Ottawa in October 2025 with the Council of Leaders representing both territorial and Indigenous governments. They made the case directly to federal ministers. The Mackenzie Valley Highway was not just infrastructure, it was sovereignty, it was reconciliation, it was climate adaptation, it was economic development, it was moral obligation. Simpson emerged from those meetings with confidence. He told reporters he expected the territorial government would break ground on the $1.65 billion Mackenzie Valley Highway within the next 2 to 3 years. For communities that had waited 68 years, even 2 more years felt like victory. The financing structure was becoming clear. The traditional federal-territorial cost split would see Ottawa contribute 75% of funding, approximately $1.24 billion, with the territory covering the remaining 25%. Multiple federal funding sources were available: the $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund announced in Budget 2025, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, and the National Trade Corridors Fund. The Major Projects Office could coordinate approvals and accelerate regulatory processes. Why had this highway taken 68 years when southern provinces built thousands of kilometers of roads in far less time? The challenges were real but not insurmountable. The route traverses permafrost that shifts with temperature changes. Construction can only occur during brief summer windows when ground is accessible. Materials and equipment must be transported vast distances at high cost. Environmental protections require careful assessment of impacts on wildlife, water, and indigenous lands. But these challenges existed in 1958 when the promise was first made. They existed in 1978 and 1998 and 2018. The difference now was political will. Mark Carney's government faced a crisis of sovereignty. Trump threatened annexation. Russia and China expanded their Arctic presence. Climate change was opening new shipping routes and resource access. Canada needed to demonstrate effective control over its Arctic territories. Building the Mackenzie Valley Highway served multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. It improved military mobility for Canadian armed forces. It supported resource development that generated tax revenue. It reduced dependence on unstable ice roads threatened by warming temperatures. And critically, it demonstrated to the world that Canada invests in its Arctic communities rather than abandoning them to isolation. For the people actually living in those communities, the highway represented transformation of daily life in ways that urban Canadians take for granted. Consider Mary, a mother of 3 in Tulita. When her youngest child developed appendicitis in February 2024, the winter road was closed due to unseasonably warm weather. The medevac flight took 6 hours to arrive because poor visibility delayed departure from Yellowknife. By the time her daughter reached the hospital, her appendix had ruptured. She survived but endured weeks of complications that could have been prevented with faster access to care. With an all-season highway, Mary could have driven her daughter to medical care in hours. The highway would mean she could make that drive any day of the year without depending on weather, airplanes, or luck. Consider John, a young entrepreneur in Fort Good Hope who wanted to start a construction business. The cost of bringing equipment and materials to his community by air cargo made every project economically unviable. He watched contracts go to companies from Yellowknife or further south because they had reliable supply chains. The highway would change that calculation. He could truck in materials, he could compete, he could build a business that employed his neighbors and served his community. Consider the Dean elders in Norman Wells, who watched their grandchildren leave for education or employment opportunities in the south and never return because the isolation and high cost of living made coming home unsustainable. The highway would not solve every challenge their communities face, but it would make return migration economically feasible. Families could stay connected, culture could be preserved, communities could grow rather than slowly deplete. The economic analysis prepared for the territorial government quantified some of these benefits. The all-season highway would save $1.3 million annually by eliminating the need to construct temporary winter roads each year. Tourism would increase, generating over $500,000 in new economic activity and 10 permanent jobs annually. If the proposed Mackenzie gas pipeline project proceeded, energy firms would save $1.215 billion over 45 years of operation due to reduced transportation costs. Corporate after-tax returns on resource projects would increase by almost $2 billion, making exploration economically viable. The cost of consumer goods in isolated communities would decline as truck transport replaced expensive air cargo. But these numbers fail to capture the human dimension. What is the dollar value of a mother being able to reach medical care for her child without relying on a medevac flight? What is the economic benefit of young people being able to build careers in their home communities rather than migrating south permanently? What is the sovereignty value of demonstrating to the world that Canada maintains functional infrastructure in its Arctic territories? These questions do not fit neatly into cost-benefit spreadsheets, but they matter profoundly to the people affected and to Canada's strategic interests. The route of the highway tells a story about who is prioritized and who is forgotten. From Wrigley in the south to Norman Wells in the north, 321 kilometers through the traditional territories of multiple Indigenous nations, the Sahtu Dene and Métis, the Dehcho First Nations, communities that never ceded their lands through treaties, but watched resource companies extract wealth while roads were built everywhere, except where Indigenous people lived. The environmental assessment process required extensive consultation with Indigenous governments and organizations. Their participation was not merely procedural. The highway could not be built without land access agreements with Indigenous landholders. Construction, operation, and maintenance would need to respect traditional knowledge about wildlife migration, water management, and seasonal environmental conditions. For Indigenous leaders, the highway represented an opportunity to correct historical injustice while building economic futures on their own terms. Chief Dene of the Dene government participated in the Ottawa meetings with federal ministers. He insisted that Indigenous communities must be partners, not just consulted stakeholders. He wanted guarantees of Indigenous employment during construction, Indigenous business participation in contracts, and Indigenous involvement in highway operations after completion. These were not unreasonable demands. These were requirements for reconciliation to mean something concrete rather than remaining an empty slogan. The Hillcore Group, a major investment firm, expressed interest in a public-private partnership to build and operate the highway. Some community leaders welcomed private sector involvement if it accelerated construction. Others worried that privatization would lead to tolls or profit extraction at the expense of local needs. The debate highlighted tensions between urgency and control. After 68 years of waiting, communities wanted the highway built immediately, but they also wanted to ensure it served their interests rather than becoming another infrastructure project imposed from outside. Climate change added urgency to the project in ways that were not foreseen in 1958. The Mackenzie Valley Winter Road, the temporary ice highway that connects communities during winter months, was becoming increasingly unreliable. Warmer temperatures shortened the season when ice was thick enough to support truck traffic. Some years, the road opened late or closed early, disrupting the carefully planned logistics of annual resupply. In 2023, unseasonably warm weather in March caused sections of the winter road to become impassable, weeks before the expected closure date. Trucks carrying fuel and food supplies turned back. Communities faced shortages. Prices spiked as remaining inventory dwindled, and air cargo became the only option. The territorial government recognized that winter roads were no longer viable, long-term transportation infrastructure in a warming Arctic. All-season roads were not luxury. They were a necessity for communities to survive and function in the decades ahead. The economic viability of Arctic communities depended on reliable year-round access to supplies and markets. The strategic sovereignty dimension became impossible to ignore after Russia's invasion of Ukraine exposed how quickly geopolitical stability could collapse. Russia had been aggressively expanding military infrastructure in its Arctic territories, building bases, deploying icebreakers, and asserting control over shipping routes. China declared itself a near-Arctic state, despite being thousands of kilometers from the Arctic Circle, and invested in icebreaker construction and resource partnerships with Arctic nations. Canada's Arctic was no longer a remote frontier ignored by global powers. It was contested space where sovereignty required demonstrated presence and capability. The Mackenzie Valley Highway would enable rapid deployment of Canadian Armed Forces personnel and equipment to the Western Arctic. It would support operation and maintenance of radar installations and forward operating bases. It would facilitate resource development that generated tax revenue to fund defense spending. And critically, it would demonstrate to allies and adversaries alike that Canada possessed the will and capability to build and maintain infrastructure in its Arctic territories. A nation that could not connect its own communities with roads would struggle to assert credible sovereignty over vast northern territories. For the Russian government, watching Canada finally build the Mackenzie Valley Highway after 68 years of delay would send a clear message. Canadian Arctic policy was no longer characterized by neglect and empty promises. Under Mark Carney's leadership, Canada was making generational investments in Arctic infrastructure to secure sovereignty and support communities. Russia's attempts to dominate Arctic shipping routes and resource access would face a more capable and committed Canadian presence. The highway was not a military installation, but its strategic implications were unmistakable. The construction timeline remained uncertain despite Premier Simpson's optimism. The environmental assessment by the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board was still in progress. The developer's assessment report had been submitted, but final approval had not been granted. Land access agreements with Indigenous governments were being negotiated, but not yet finalized. Funding commitments from Ottawa were expected, but not yet confirmed in writing. The territorial government hoped to break ground within 2 to 3 years, meaning actual construction might begin in late 2027 or early 2028. For communities that had waited since 1958, the prospect of seeing construction equipment arrive in 2028 felt simultaneously exhilarating and surreal. Could this finally be happening? After 6 decades of broken promises, could the highway actually be built? Danny McNeely's comment captured that mixture of hope and skepticism. They've been talking about the Mackenzie Valley Highway all-season road for over 50 years. If it doesn't happen, we ain't gonna stop. We'll talk for another 50 years about that. This was not resignation. This was determination rooted in bitter experience. These communities would not give up. They would continue advocating, organizing, and demanding the infrastructure that Canadian citizens elsewhere enjoyed as a birthright. If the current political moment passed without delivering the highway, they would build coalitions and restart the campaign until they succeeded. But this time felt different. The convergence of climate change undermining winter roads, geopolitical competition threatening Arctic sovereignty, and a prime minister focused on nation-building infrastructure created conditions for action that had not existed previously. The Mackenzie Valley Highway would be built not because Southern Canadians suddenly developed compassion for isolated Arctic communities, though that would be welcome. It would be built because Canada's strategic interests required it, because military planners needed reliable logistics routes, because resource developers needed transportation infrastructure, because climate scientists warned that winter roads would fail, because international observers questioned whether Canada could govern its Arctic territories effectively. The moral case for the highway had existed since 1958. What changed was that the strategic case became impossible to ignore. When the first truck drives the full length of the completed Mackenzie Valley Highway from Wrigley to Norman Wells without waiting for winter ice, it will represent more than an infrastructure achievement. It will represent the fulfillment of a promise made in 1958 and repeated countless times over 6 decades. It will represent recognition that Canadian citizens in Arctic communities deserve the same access to transportation, healthcare, education, and economic opportunity that citizens elsewhere receive. It will represent a commitment to Arctic sovereignty, backed by tangible capability rather than empty rhetoric. And for Mary in Tulita, for John in Fort Good Hope, for the Dean elders in Norman Wells, for all the families who endured isolation and high costs and limited opportunities while waiting for their government to deliver basic infrastructure, the highway will represent liberation. Freedom to drive to medical care, freedom to start businesses, freedom to visit family, freedom to participate in the Canadian economy on equal terms. 68 years is too long to wait for freedom. But after 68 years of waiting, finally seeing construction begin will taste like victory. The Russian government will watch Canada build the Mackenzie Valley Highway and understand that Arctic neglect has ended. The Chinese government will watch and recognize that Canadian sovereignty is backed by infrastructure investment, and the people of the Mackenzie Valley will drive that highway and know that their decades of advocacy finally succeeded. The road to Norman Wells is 68 years overdue, but it is coming. And when it arrives, it will change everything.